Good morning, church. My name is Jeff. I'm one of the pastors here at Crossroads, and I'm excited to be able to share today's teaching as we continue our series through the book of Exodus. We are going to be looking at just 7 short verses today, but man, are they loaded. This is a very famous incident in Israel's history. I want to invite you to turn in your Bible to Exodus chapter 17. I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. The verses are going to be on one of these screens behind me, and I'd invite you to follow along as we read. Exodus 17, verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, take in your hands the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called that place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" And this is the word of the Lord. We've been journeying through Exodus, and you know this is the story of God's deliverance of the Hebrew people out of Egypt. And I was doing some research this week, and I was listening to Timothy Keller preach a sermon on this text, and he had a pretty great observation I'll share with you. He said this: you can take a people out of slavery in a moment, but to take the slavery out of a people, it takes a process. And so what we are seeing now, he has brought them out of Egypt. He's delivered them through the Red Sea, through miraculous signs. However, they are still responding like people who need to be delivered. It takes a process. And this very incident, this journey through the wilderness, this is where you get the expression, and maybe you've heard this if you've been in church a while, and it's usually applied to people in their 20s. He or she is going through a wilderness experience, right? You've probably heard that. And that's what this is. This is a wilderness experience because God can deliver you. He can take you out of slavery in a moment. But to take the slavery out of you, sometimes it takes a process. And that process frequently is what we refer to as the wilderness. In my own life, I experienced a kind of wilderness experience. I had grown up in the Catholic tradition. I'm from the Northeast, and we were Christmas, Easter Catholics, that kind of a thing. And I was just going into high school when I overheard a phone call and found out that my mom had been diagnosed with cancer. And that moment for me, I had some kind of, the furniture was in the room. I had a tepid faith at best. But that moment for me caused me to ask some very hard questions. And I did what a lot of people do when they enter into the wilderness, was I doubted God. I asked the same question that the Hebrew people are asking here in verse 7. Is the Lord among us or not? And I thought, as I was entering into that stage of my journey, that there is no God, and if there is a God, he is no one to be loved. He is only to be loathed because he's allowed this type of suffering and this type of trial into my life. And that word trial is appropriate here because that is exactly what is in view as we look at these 7 verses. I'm going to give you our outline. It's the charge, the trial, and the sentence. And I've chosen that language intentionally because this is legal language. Let's first look at the charge. In verse 2, it says, "So they quarreled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.'" And you see this over and over. Right? There was no water. They had no water to drink. We are thirsty. The people are thirsty. Practically, if you're leading a couple of 100,000 people through the desert, food's important, but it's not as important as water. You need water. And God has led them to a place where apparently there is no water, and so they are quarreling. That Hebrew word has a judicial connotation. This is the language of the courtroom. They have brought formal charges against Moses and saying, you have led us out here to die. We're all going to die. We're going to die. Our kids are going to die. Our livestock are going to die. And they are functionally charging him with genocide. We can surmise the severity and the implications of that charge because what does Moses say to God? He says, well, first he says, if you've ever led any people, you've probably said this to God. You said, what am I to do with these people? And then he says, they are almost ready to stone me. They have brought formal charges against Moses. Through your dereliction of duty and your general ineptitude, you have led us into a place of certain death. We're going to die of thirst because there is no water in this place. If you've ever, the wilderness, we're talking about the Negev desert. If you want to look at an absolutely barren landscape, go home and Google the Negev desert. This is where they are on the Sinai Peninsula. There's nothing. And Moses has led them to a place, or God rather, has led them to a place with no water, and they are grumbling and they are quarreling. They brought charges against Moses, and Moses, he's being accused, what? Of criminal negligence, right? Criminal negligence. He's leading them all to their certain demise. And what's very interesting, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, how Moses is kind of an intermediary. He's a bit of a mediator between Israel and God. It's very interesting when 2 weeks ago we learned that when they're complaining that God rebukes Moses for their complaint. And when they blame God for stuff, we see it right here, they also blame Moses. Moses is a kind of mediator. He's a kind of intermediary between God and Israel. And he's a foreshadowing of another intermediary who would come, a new and better Moses, and that's Jesus. And we're going to get there. Now, the point here is that you see the exasperation. It's hanging in the margins. Here are the people of Israel, and they're crying out, "We're thirsty, give us water." And then Moses is frustrated. He's like, "Why are you quarreling with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" So you have just frustration all around. You've got Israel frustrated with Moses, frustrated with God. You've got Moses frustrated with Israel, frustrated with God. Everybody's frustrated. Everybody's losing patience. Everybody except for God. It should be, it's just dripping off the page, the extent of God's patience with his people. And this is, by the way, if you've been out over these weeks, as we've been looking at the story of the Exodus, this is the big theme, right? Israel was enslaved, and then God, through Moses, shows up and he has mighty acts of judgment, 10 plagues. He just calls down all of this power to the point that Pharaoh releases them. Do you remember? He turns the Nile to blood. There's the plague of darkness and locusts and gnats and flies and frogs and etc. And then the death of the firstborn. And finally, Pharaoh relents. He says, "Take your people and go." Incredible signs and wonders. And then what happens immediately after that? Israel is being led through the desert by Moses, and they take a kind of circuitous route, and they end up with a vast desert in front of them and the Red Sea behind them. And so they're literally, tactically, between a rock and a hard place. And Pharaoh has a reversal of opinion. He has a change of heart. He says, "I'm going to pursue them, and maybe we can get our help back." And so the Israelites say what to Moses? They say, "Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to take us out here to die?" They think about this. This is short order here. The events that we just read, Exodus 17, probably happened about 6 weeks after the parting of the Red Sea. And during the parting of the Red Sea, they had just within a couple of days experienced these plagues that God had manifested to bring about their deliverance, these incredible, miraculous signs. And yet there they are. Did you have to bring us out? Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us out here? They are spiritually short-sighted. They're chronologically myopic. They have experienced God's grace and his power and his providence in a way that none of us can even dream of, yet here they are again. Did you have to bring us all the way out here? Why did you bring us? Verse 3, why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? And it's really interesting. Something else that Keller pointed out, he is a great metaphor, so I'm gonna give it to you. In his sermon on Exodus 17, he said, Exodus is like walking into Exodus is like walking up to a portrait in a museum and thinking, wow, that's ugly, and then realizing it's a mirror. And we can sit here, right? We have the brevity of hindsight. We have the luxury of hindsight, the luxury of history. We get to read all of the Torah, all of the Pentateuch, and say, oh, look at how silly Israel was, just despite God's constant provision and showing up and delivering them again and again and again, despite their petulance, despite their short-sightedness and their short memories. And God continues to show them up. Oh, my goodness, what a silly, foolish people they are. I'm so glad we're nothing like that. But really, it's not a portrait. It's a mirror. And this is one of the big points of Exodus. This is one of the big points of this narrative in particular, is that we have a collective problem with our spiritual memory. We have a tremendous propensity to ignore and forget the thousands and millions of the ways that God has shown up in our lives, the way that God has answered our prayers, the way that God has blessed us. The moment one prayer goes unanswered. In the military, we had an expression for this, and there's a lot of biological reasons for it. I won't belabor you with the data, but we as a people, we tend to learn from cautionary tales, not superlative examples. If you've ever had kids, you know, you tell them not to touch the hot stove, and then they got to do it just one time, and then they learn. And so there's a reason why our psychology and why our memory tends to be shaped this way, where we will ignore 100 blessings because one unfortunate incident, one unanswered prayer, or one storm comes into our life. We are chronologically, spiritually myopic. We have a short-sightedness, right? And one diagnosis, one betrayal, one answered prayer sticks out for us in our memory, in our mind's eye, way more than the hundreds of thousands or millions of times God has blessed us and kept us and delivered us, right? And it would be really tempting to look at this story and think, wow, Israel, how foolish, how silly. But this is what all of us do. This is Israel, the Exodus, the story is as much about them as it is about us. This is why we're calling this the gospel according to Moses. This has tremendous applicability to our lives, right? And it would be tempting to think that the story of your life is one of God being impatient with you, or one with God being completely unconcerned with you. But if you had eyes to see it, the way that we're given a kind of heaven's eye view of Israel's story, if you were sitting in the heaven's eye view of your life, what you would see is the same thing that the narrator is trying to communicate through this narrative, through all of Exodus, is that God is infinitely patient with you. When you doubt him, when you doubt his love, when you doubt his power, when you doubt his providence, when you forget his blessing, when you ignore the unanswered prayers, or when you ignore the answered prayers and only focus on the unanswered ones, when you doubt him, when you shake your fist at the sky, he's patient with you. I was thinking back to my wilderness experience when I was entering high school. I overheard a phone call and found out my mom had cancer. And this was on the heels of my dad leaving and my dog running away. It was like a 3-month period of time. And that moment began a kind of journey for me through this wilderness. And it wasn't, I was spiritually short-sighted. I ignored the millions of ways God had blessed me because one rainstorm had come into my life. We all do it. We all do it. But here's what you have to hear. God, despite our collective lack of faith, despite our collective short-term memory loss, when it comes to his provision and his blessing, he's infinitely patient with us, just like he's infinitely patient with Israel. Let's look and see how. Next, the trial. The trial. Everything that happens in verse 5 is kind of an answer to the conundrum that's laid out in verses 1 through 4. We have a charge brought against Moses. Moses is kind of standing in the place of God as an intermediary. Israel's mad at God and at Moses, and it's a capital offense. And so there is a formal charge. There has to be a trial. What does that trial look like? Well, this is very interesting. The Lord said to Moses in verse 5, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile. And go, I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So what's interesting about this, and all the commentators point this out, and if you've ever been in the desert, you know that you don't look for water at the top of a rock. You go to the low place. When I was stationed in the military, I got stationed in the Mojave Desert. They ask you all the places you'd really like to go, and then they send you to the other one. And so I spent 2.5, 3 years in the Mojave Desert, and you have to go through all this like desert survival training when you get there, because occasionally people get lost and left behind, and then you'll just find some bones like 6 weeks later. Not kidding. And so everybody knows that you don't go to the top of a rock to find water. You go to a low place. Yet here we are, and God is instructing them. Keep in mind, he is the one who has ordered their path. He is the one that has drawn them into a place with no water. And then he says, you're going to go to the top of this rock, the most unlikely place where you're going to find water, where you're going to find God's blessing and his grace. And that's exactly the point. The whole point is that God's grace tends to flow in the unlikeliest of places. This is about a year ago, and it was probably a Sunday afternoon, and Allie and I found ourselves at a winery up on top of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And it was a kind of crowded day. I think they had some kind of an event, and so there were a bunch of people sitting around our table, and there was one family in particular that ended up sitting with us. And as the conversation sometimes goes, they asked me what I did for a living. And I told them, well, I'm a pastor. And it might have been the Chardonnay, but this woman kind of became a little undone. And I could tell her countenance instantly changed. It happens sometimes when people find out you're a Christian. It's interesting. And she disclosed that I believe it was her son, and he was probably my age, probably close to 50 years old, was suffering from an inoperable terminal brain tumor. And I thought, well, there goes our Sunday afternoon. And I didn't have any words. I wasn't going to launch into a 5-point excursus on a rationale for pain and suffering in a Christian context. It just wasn't appropriate. But she was mad, and she was angry. And she was very literally going through a desert. And something else happened as I was sitting across from them, really just trying to do my best to listen and to be compassionate. Her son had this kind of look in his eyes. And I will never know what was going on in his interior life in that moment. And I do not know what happened. But in my heart of hearts, I was hoping. I was hoping that though he was not going to live a long life by our standards, it was probably going to be cut short statistically speaking. And I don't know what God did through those circumstances, but I'm holding out hope that he found grace in the unlikeliest of places, because it is precisely in the wilderness that God shows us who he is and how much he cares for us. Look, I bought a ridiculously powerful flashlight because I have a lot of critters in my backyard killing my chickens, and I want to be able to see them at night. In the daytime, you don't even notice how bright it is, but at night, it lights up the sky. In the same way, when you are going through the darkest periods in your life, those are the places, the unlikeliest places where you can see best God's love and his grace and his mercy for you. Because look, when things are going well, when everything's going right, when your relationships are all right, when your career is all right, when your health is all right, it's really hard to see a bright light in the darkness. But when you are thirsty, when you are in the desert and you are racked with thirst, if you've ever been really, really thirsty, you appreciate water in a whole new way. And in the same way, in my own story, it wasn't until this season of my life where I had experienced darkness, where I had experienced wilderness, that I began asking hard questions. I had some kind of a tepid, insubstantial faith as a young man. But that point in time for me, when I found out that my mom was sick and my dad had left and my dog ran away, that point in time for me began a kind of 10-year journey where I was forced to ask really hard questions. And then when I was finally in a place to observe the goodness of God, to understand the gospel of grace, that though I'm a sinner, though I had lost patience with him, he had not lost patience with me, and that he loved me to high heaven so much that he gave his son to make a way for me to go home, all of a sudden in the darkness, in the unlikeliest of places, The unlikeliest of people to ever bow their knee became a Christian. And so that conversation with that young man and his mom, I hold out hope. I hold out hope that his life might have been cut short by 25 or 30 years, but that is nothing compared to the other side of eternity. And just maybe in his darkest moment, he was able to see the light of God's love and grace and mercy in the unlikeliest of places. And just maybe he ended up with a saving faith in Christ. And so that's the point. God, only when you experience real darkness, C.S. Lewis said it really well in The Problem of Pain. He said, we could ignore even pleasure, but pain insists on being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Rick Warren said it equally well. He said, you never know God is all you need until you find God is all you have. Now the sentence. I'll read from verse 5 on one more time. The Lord answered Moses, go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. The question that's hanging in the margins is summarized at the end of 7. Is the Lord among us or not? And we might ask that question in a number of ways. And sometimes it goes like this. Does God deserve the blame for the suffering that I've endured in my life? Does God deserve the blame for all the hardship, oppression, sickness, and death I see in the world around me? Is God among us or not? It was the same question I was asking as a young boy when I heard that phone call and I walked into the winter night. I was asking, is God really among us or not? Does he love me? Does he? I want you to see what happens. God responds to this whole conundrum in verse 5. He says, go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile. Now, it's a little comedic if you can just step back for a second. Here's Israel, chronically short-sighted. Their short-term memory is shot. They've forgotten all the ways that God has provided for them up till now. And here they are, we're going to die of thirst. Moses, we're going to stone you. And Moses is like, what am I going to do? And God says, here's what you do. Go get the staff. Now, the staff is obviously emblematic of God's power. But the staff in the ancient world was also always emblematic of judicial strength, of judicial power, the right to judge, the right to execute. Everyone from the Sumerian kings to the Phoenicians to Pharaoh to the staff of Moses is a famous example of this. In ancient Rome, they had something called the fasces. And the fasces were a series of staffs with an axe in the middle of them. And that gave whoever held it the right to sit in judgment in a judicial sense of somebody who had committed a crime. And that symbol is actually persisted to this day. If you look on the seal of the United States Senate, there's 2 of them at the very bottom. It's a symbol of divine justice, the power to judge. And so first thing you want to notice is God says, go get that staff. The one that turned the Nile to blood, the one that parted the Red Sea, go get that staff. Can you imagine? It's not here, but hanging in the margins, if you will. Can you imagine the Israelites? Right? They're like, Moses, we're going to stone you. And then he gets the staff. They're like, that staff? And then, and so it's clear here, Moses has the staff of justice. He's not on trial. And there's a jury. Who does he take with him? He has the elders of Israel. And it says that they passed by the people, right? Go out in front of the people. He's passing by the people. So Moses is not on trial. And the people somehow are not on trial. Even though it was Moses' impatience with the people and God, and the people's impatience with Moses and God seems to be the aggravation at the top of this account. Moses is not on trial and the people are not on trial. And then something absolutely shocking happens. And, the NIV translation really doesn't do it justice, but in the King James and in the Hebrew, it's behold. Verse 6, behold, I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. This is the only example in the entire Hebrew scriptures of God standing before someone else. To stand before someone is like to stand stand before the bench. If you've ever seen maybe old movies where people are on trial, even like Good Will Hunting, do you remember where he's on trial at the beginning of the movie? They put you in a dock. They put you in a little, where the defendant sits in a little box, and you stand what? Before the judge. Romans 14, we will all stand before the judge. To stand before someone is to come under their judicial authority. One commentator put it like this: when God instructs Moses to take the rod and stand before the people, it symbolizes God's assumption of responsibility for the crisis at hand. This act demonstrates that God, though not directly at fault, willingly bears the weight of the people's dissatisfaction and the ensuing need for resolution. Do you see what happened? Moses deserved to be on trial. He lost his patience. Israel deserved to be on trial. They lost their patience with Moses and they lost their patience with God. But neither one of them stands trial. What happens? God says, I will stand before you. I will take responsibility for this. This is fascinating. Now, this begs the question, who would be stupid enough to put God on trial? I'm so glad that we have this account of this primitive, foolish, short-sighted, quick-to-forget people, and this has nothing to do with me or my immediate context or the people I know. Who would be so stupid as to put God on trial? But we do it all the time. We do it all the time. I'll give you a couple of ways. When we look at suffering, I think back to that encounter I had at the winery. It's the same question all of us ask. We think, why would a good and powerful God allow suffering like this to come into my life? It's the same question I asked when I heard about my mom's cancer diagnosis. How could a good and powerful God allow this to come into my life? And what are we doing? We're putting God on trial. We're saying, in effect, that I know better how my life is supposed to go. And there's a logical fallacy buried in that whole rationale, and I want you to understand it, because what it's saying is, just because I cannot see a good reason for the suffering, just because I do not perceive a compelling rationale why God has allowed these trials into my life, there can't be one. And that ascribes to people a trait that we don't have, which is omnipotence. We don't know everything. And just go with me here. Just because you can't see a good reason for the suffering in the world or the suffering that God allows into your life doesn't mean that there isn't one. That mom, I could tell her heart was breaking. Of course. But she had made the same assumption so many of us make, that just because she could not see a good reason for the unfortunate diagnosis, that there couldn't be one. And she was putting God on trial. Next is, this is the flavor of the month, moral relativism. We in our cultural moment, a lot of people, increasingly so, like to believe that our moral judgment is better than God. And you come to some of the Bible's traditional values around same-sex relationships, premarital sex, gender identity. We can go on and on here. But modern people like to assume that our moral, our kind of sense of morality and our moral judgment is superior to God's. What are we doing? You're putting God on trial. You're putting God in the dock. Next, there's this was me. I was an atheist for many years. After that moment where I walked into the night, and I think it was that night, I decided that this is if there is a God, he's nobody to follow, he's nobody to believe in. If he exists at all, I should loathe him for allowing the suffering to come in my life. And I became a functional atheist for years. And atheists, I've got a whole section on my shelf back there. I read all of them, and you know what they all want? They all demand a sign. They all want proof. As if seeing something absolutely miraculous would somehow sway them from their position. I have to tell you, it won't. Anecdotally, I'm a pastor, and I see this play out 100 different ways. I'll have two people experience the same thing. One person will see the unadulterated hand of God moving in incredible, inexplicable ways, and it drives them to their knees, and it drives them to a place of faith and belief, and another person will ignore it completely. Even if you were given the sign you would ask for. There's no guarantee that you would believe and become a person of faith. And it is saying that human reason and wisdom is the highest order in the universe, and you're putting God on trial. Then you've got your moral outrage. And this happens when there's a pandemic, a school shooting, September 11th, October 7th, some atrocity has brought you to your knees, and you're asking the same question that everybody's asking: where was God? And it's the same question the Israelites are asking: is the Lord among us? Everyone asks that question. And when we ask that question, we're putting God in the dock. We're sitting in judgment of God. What is shocking, what is the most shocking part of this, is he sits still for it. He sits still for it. Do you see? He says, go up and strike the rock. Let the judgment fall on me. I try to look for good contemporary examples and movie illustrations so everybody will nod and get the point. And I struggled this week. I could not find an example of this. I could not find an example of an exemplary leader, a morally superior character taking on the burden and the guilt of a people who actually deserve judgment and who is stricken on their behalf. I couldn't come up with one. I couldn't find one. Marie Antoinette, she had it coming. Let them eat cake. She kind of got what she deserved. Saddam Hussein kind of got what he deserved. There's only one example that I could find. And if you've ever read or seen The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you know where I'm going. The whole story of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is about these Pevensey kids, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. And in this particular book, there's a series of them. They go through a wardrobe and they find themselves transported to this alternate world, Narnia. And in Narnia, there's a kind of curse over the world, and it's always winter, but never Christmas, and there's an evil white witch who controls everything. And one of the Pevensey kids, one of the brothers, Edmund, ends up selling out his family and all of Narnia for Turkish delight, which is like a fun little dessert treat. And because of that sin, the white witch now seeks to make this curse permanent, but there's a whisper. There is a whisper that Aslan is afoot, and Aslan is this great lion. If you've ever read the book or seen the movie, they did a pretty good job at the movie. He is terrifying. At one point, Lucy, the sister, asks, is he safe? And the answer is, safe? No, he's not safe, but he's good. And so Aslan meets Edmund, and in a very real sense, consoles him for his shortcomings and the wounds that his old sin had produced. And then there comes a trial. There comes a point in time where somebody has to pay the debt. And Aslan goes to Cair Paravel. And he's a mighty lion. He could have taken the entire army out. Everybody was there. He didn't have to go. But he lets them bind him. He lays down his power and he lets himself be tied and bound. And they cut his mane off, and then they kill him. And then he's resurrected. And because of something about his life, his sacrifices, and his resurrection, somehow breaks this curse over Narnia. And then we find out, Lewis uses incredible language to describe it, there's a deep magic that made peace possible. That deep magic is love. Aslan so loved Edmund, and he was a Weasley kid. He was slimy. There was nothing likable about him. He sold out his brothers and his sisters for Turkish delight. It's like a fruit roll-up. Yet Aslan was infinitely patient with him, and he allowed himself to be bound. If you go to the very end, and there's a spoiler alert, because if you haven't read all the books, you're not a good Christian, so I'm going to tell you right now. You go to the very last book in the series, it's called The Final Battle, The Last Battle. And in the very last scene, in the last battle, the Pevensey kids are transported to Narnia once again. And they're running up this mountain that is impossibly high, and they're moving impossibly fast, and the sky is bluer than they could ever imagine. And they finally get there, and they see Aslan again. Only he changes before their eyes. And he becomes Jesus. This is why Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Jesus is infinitely patient with you, and there is a deep magic in the universe, and it is love. And if you have ever doubted God's patience with you, if you've ever doubted that God is intimately involved in your life, and if you've ever thought that he's lost patience with you, you look to the cross. Because he didn't. He said, do you not know I could call down 70 legions of angels? He did not have to go to the cross. He allowed himself to go to the cross for you. And the deep magic, the thing that held him to the cross was love. He loves you. He loves you. This concludes the teaching of God's word.